the Molyneux problem in a nutshell. This video is pretty much going to be a follow-up to the last video, the UPB video I did. Namely, what I'm going to do is I'm going to answer the questions that people asked on that video. That's sort of my way of closing the gaps in what I said, specifically because the questions reference or open up the discussion to what the problem is with Stefan Molyneux as a whole. Not just UPB, not just that whole element, but what's the problem with Steph, his channel, his philosophy, and so forth. And that's what I want to talk about in this sort of fashion. So, yeah, let's start off. So the first question these are in no particular order. I just picked out the questions that people asked on the video, which wasn't that many, but here you go. Basically what I talked about in the video, so this person is referencing something I talked about in the video. What I talked about was, if say there's glass falling from some building and it impales someone in the head, then what does the NAP say about that? And I was criticizing the NAP because I was saying how if the NAP doesn't say that you should help this person. I also may have mentioned that one interpretation of the NAP could have it that the NAP is violated if you don't help the person. And what I meant by that specifically was the NAP isn't necessarily violated, but UPB certainly is, because it is universally non-preferable to be in that situation where you're impaled by glass and nobody around you is helping you. And yet, the NAP, which is supposedly derived from UPB, doesn't include that stuff. So, okay, I'm going to read what this guy said. He asked, okay, glass dropping from the sky. I would suspect someone would be liable for that. Anyway, doing nothing to help someone isn't violating the NAP. It's a dickbag move, but it's not aggressing against someone. That's like saying, you're not helping people who are currently starving to death right now, you are thus aggressing against them. Does not make logical sense to me. Okay, so okay, let's talk about this. Glass dropping from the sky, and someone would be liable for that. Sure, they would, but who cares? I mean, that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about glass falls from the sky, and what do you do next? What happens in those next seconds? Now, the NAP says nothing. Who cares? A consequentialist morality or an empathy-based morality would say, look, you helped the person that was aggressed against by the glass. You helped the person that's injured. Right? You don't look for whoever's liable for that. You do that later, or you don't even, like, who even cares about that? Who cares who has to pay? That's not the point. The point is there's someone who's injured, somebody has to fix them, somebody has to help them. The easiest thing would be just the people around that individual help them and maybe even pay for their treatment. That's, I mean, obviously that's simplistic, but instead of, like, the problem with the statement is that you're trying to find whoever's liable for this injury, when in reality the problem is somebody's injured, they need to be helped, not who's responsible for this. Like, the who's responsible question just keeps coming up, and it's not important. I mean, supposedly if you want to, you know, fairly allocate resources, then you look for who's liable to pay for this person's treatment later on. You know, after they're already treated, after the problem is solved, but that's a different issue. That's a different question. Who has to pay for this? I don't care. The only thing I care about, what I talked about, was what do you do in this situation when the person is injured through natural causes? How do you help them? What do you do? The NAP doesn't say you do anything, and that's the problem. And like this guy says, you know, it doesn't violate a NAP, it's a dickbag move. Okay. If it's a dickbag move, then why is that not in your morality? Why is that not in your moral system? See, with Stefan Molyneux, he's like, his entire morality, his entire ethical framework is just the NAP, property rights, you know, libertarian, whatever, and UPB. That's it. That's all there is. And yet, saying something like it's a dickbag move not to help someone who's just impaled by glass, that's a moral statement. That's a normative statement. Okay, there's a precedent in this. There's a precedent. You prefer, and I'm using the UPB language here, you prefer to help the individual that's injured. So why then is that not in your morality? This is something that bothers me. It really bothers me because I encounter it all the time in real life, is that persons say, well, I prefer this, and that's just my opinion. No, that's not just your opinion, that's a moral claim you just made. If you prefer X, then that is a moral claim, that is a normative claim. That you prefer X factors into your morality, whether you like it or not. So you can't say, no, that's not morality I'm talking about, those aren't my morals, that's just I prefer X. No, you can't do that. That's nonsense. If you say I prefer X, then that's part of your morality. And it's part of Steph's morality as well, except it's not, because he keeps doing this fallacy. This is a fallacy. This is a fallacy where people don't understand what morality actually is, what normative claims actually are. Okay? If you have a precedent of some sort, if you have an opinion, if you have a normative view, then that factors into morality. That's what morality is. That's what ethics is. Ethics isn't just some principles you should adhere to or not, right? Yeah, so that's the problem with that. And then he says, that's like saying you're not helping people who are currently starving to death right now. Oh, right, because he was saying that it doesn't violate the NAP. Well, even if it doesn't violate the NAP to not help someone, it violates, it makes you a dickbag. So why have the NAP, actually? Why not have another principle called the non-dickbag principle? The NDP. And follow that, where people aren't dickbags instead of just non-aggressors. I mean, that would solve this problem in this particular case, right? Instead, we pick the NAP. Why? Anyway, wait, the point I'm making is here, just by saying that it's a dickbag move not to help this injured person, you're already making a moral claim, and you need to rethink your entire moral framework if that preference is not in it. Because it's definitely universally non-preferable to be the individual who's injured who nobody is helping. It's definitely universally non-preferable to be in that position. And yet UPB, which is a model based entirely on preference, doesn't seem to look at this. Doesn't seem to look at a case like this where, hey, there's a preference for this stuff. Even Molyneux has a preference. Even Molyneux, prefers empathy to non-empathy, right? But the NAP doesn't say anything about empathy or not empathy. Okay? A society built on the NAP could function perfectly if every individual within that society was a sociopath. And of course you wouldn't want to live in that, because you don't want to live in a society with sociopaths, because that's not going to turn out well, even if they do follow the NAP. So yeah, that's like saying you're not helping people who are currently starving to death right now. Okay, yeah, I mean, I'm not helping them, but it's not like I can. How am I supposed to help them? I mean, if I had the resources and the means and the whatever, I would, right? Or somebody would. And that's sort of the point. You can't just say... You can't just say... The point I was making with why the NAP doesn't necessarily apply in this case, why the NAP is perhaps broken, is because of the universally preferable thing. It is universally non-preferable to be a starving individual right now in the world, despite the fact that nobody is aggressing against you, right? So yeah, the NAP can be being broken, even though you're not being aggressed against. Because if we interpret the NAP as something derived from UPB, which it is according to the book, then that breaks down. But then of course you have to acknowledge, given that this is a flaw, you have to acknowledge that the NAP isn't derived from UPB, in which case the NAP is once again just arbitrary and pointless, which I don't want to get into again. I'm just poking holes in the entire argument there. Yeah, as to how to fix starvation in the world right now, I mean, I don't have the answers to that. That's an entirely different issue. The only thing I would say to that is I would encourage people not to be selfish, and if there was a hungry person in front of me and I could give them food, then I would, or if somebody came to me and asked me to give up my food for them, then I would do that. Right? I would do that. I wouldn't go help starving people because I don't have the means, let alone the desire. It's not that simple. Anyway, moving on. Right, this is still the same person. He had a really long comment. In regards to the NAP, property rights are a requirement, seeing as if you don't own anything, you can't be aggressed against. This is due to the fact that people own their persons, and by extension, the results of their labor. Okay? So how is it that property rights are an act of aggression? If you don't own anything, you can't be aggressed against. But if you say property rights only extend to your own person, and you alone, then you get other problems like the tragedy of the commons. No one owns anything, so that they use anything they can to depletion. If you say people can come together as a group and do things collectively, then what's stopping other people from just taking everything if no one owns it? But if no, they didn't contribute, so they can't have any, but then that's just implying property rights. Okay. There's a lot wrong in this statement. So I didn't really talk about property rights in the UPB video. I talked about them a tiny bit, which is why I wanted to do this video, to really talk about property rights and what I think about them. And this is another huge problem with Steph, this whole property rights issue. Okay, the very first thing you said, property rights are requirements, seeing as if you don't own anything, you can't be aggressed against. No. No, that is simply 100% false. Property rights are not necessary for the NAP to make sense. They aren't. They really, really aren't. You know, when I talked about the NAP, when we derived the NAP in UPB, when I talked about the NAP in the last video, I didn't talk about property rights at all. You know, I don't even mention ownership or property or any of that to talk about when you get aggressed against, or when something, when there is aggression, when there is a universally non-preferable situation that you can be in. I don't even use that kind of language. Of course you're going to say, okay, well, you don't use the word, but the idea is still there. No, well, see, the idea kind of depends on the word choice. Property rights is a weird idea. Okay, how do you define property? Let's delve into the semantics here a bit. There's two spectra for defining this. Either it's completely arbitrary, right? Because either property rights is defined in terms of ownership, and ownership is defined in terms of property rights, in which case it's circular and arbitrary. And if that's the case, then you libertarians definitely don't get what you want. You guys definitely don't get what you want because you like to believe that it's not arbitrary. Okay, so let's look over here on the other side. If property rights is not arbitrary, then what is it? How do we define it? As far as I'm concerned, there's only one way to define property rights in a way that's realistic. The idea of property, the idea itself in our minds, is something that comes about when an individual has something that is dear to them, that matters to them. They have a need, or a want, or a something that they believe they have the right to exercise control over, that they think they control, or that they want to control. And they call that their property. That's what property rights is. Now, if that's the definition we take, then there's other problems. There's immediate other problems, because suddenly the entire system falls apart. Because if you define property rights in terms of preference, which you should, because because this entire model is generated by universally preferable behavior, right? Which means everything's supposed to be derived from preference. And if property rights is derived from preference, then you run into other problems, because property rights basically becomes the equivalent of just something that, something that an individual desires. Yeah, more or less. Like, property rights becomes something very, very general. It basically becomes another word for preference. And if it's another word for preference, then I sort of lost my train of thought. If it's another word for preference, you will run into other problems with the NAP and with UPB. So let's assume that property rights is somehow different from preference. Okay, if property rights is somehow different from preference, then it definitely doesn't need to be there when we talk about the NAP, because I didn't talk about property rights when I talked about the NAP. I talked about preference. Okay, the NAP is defined in terms of preferences. Like, we have, okay, human beings have preferences, right? We have needs. I like to use the model of Maslow's hierarchy of needs when talking about human needs as a whole, because Maslow's hierarchy categorizes them in a pretty neat way. You have the more primitive, superficial needs at the bottom, and you have the less superficial, sort of more intellectual needs at the top. That's pretty much how Maslow works, right? Maslow's hierarchy is all you need to talk about the NAP, right? It's literally the only thing that needs to be there. The NAP is something, Like your body is aggressed against, or your property is aggressed against. Well, all that is the bottom two layers of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Something on that level gets violated for the individual. You know, their desire to be, I don't know, if someone's murdering you, then your desire to have life is being violated. If something is being stolen from you, then your desire to have comfort is being violated, which is the second tier of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? You don't need to talk about property at all. You don't even need to mention that stuff. All you need to worry about is this. So why do you say here, why do you tell me that you need property rights? Okay, this is due to the fact that people own their persons and by extension the results of their labor. No, they don't. Ownership is this is a fantasy that you have invented. Okay, ownership is it's an abstract idea that pretty much protects people's wants and desires in a sort of way that we can agree on is fair and just. That's what ownership is. It's not like something metaphysical that's just there in the ether. It's something that philosophers have made up. It's something we've made up to make ourselves feel good, to make ourselves feel in control. It's not actually there, right? It doesn't actually have to be there. Yeah, because think about it. Think about it. People own their persons and the results of their labor. Okay. Actually, you know what? No, I'm going to talk about this a little bit after I get down to what he said later. So how is that property rights are an act of aggression? Well, okay, what I meant specifically with property rights is, again, it can be an act of aggression if you interpret aggression through the UPB lens, which is that if it's something universally non-preferable, then it's aggression. And you can easily figure out how property rights can do that. Imagine this for a second. Imagine that you live in a house and that everything around you is somebody else's property, right? And let's say that on that property, all these people decide to put up a sign that says, fuck you, to you. Okay? Or something insulting or something that, I don't know, insults you or hurts you or whatever. And they all do this, and they do this to spite you. Is that not aggression? No, not by the libertarian model, but of course that's universally non-preferable. Of course nobody would want to be in that situation. Of course that's aggression in the classical sense, in that you do not feel good if that happens to you. Why don't you call that aggression? Why is that not something that's of moral interest? Why is that allowed by the NAP? Why is that something that on paper Stefan Molyneux should be okay with, but in practice something he would be against because he wouldn't want to be in that situation because nobody would? And the immediate question here that I imagine Molyneux could even say is, he would say, oh, well, why are they doing this? How to get there? It doesn't matter why they're doing it. It doesn't matter how it got there. Maybe they just don't like the way you look. Maybe they're really racist or something to that effect. Okay, it doesn't matter how they got there. You can come up with any reason why they got there, why they want to do this. The point is they're doing it. The point is they're doing it, and it doesn't violate the NAP, but it's still obviously immoral. It's still obviously something you want. Okay, maybe it's not immoral, but it's non-preferable. It's universally non-preferable. Okay? That's what I mean is property rights can be an act of aggression. Another example is, let's say I'm walking down the street and somebody buys the property I'm walking in, and all of a sudden I'm committing a crime by walking through private property. That's also something that could happen, right? So you can aggress against people that way. Again, the point is, aggression isn't like physical violence or violence against property. Aggression is anything that happens to you that you don't like. That's what aggression is. That's what aggression is by the UPB model. Because in the UPB model, it's universally preferable if it's this, it's universally non-preferable if it's that. It's universally non-preferable, and that's what makes it aggression. And even if your definition of aggression doesn't involve that, then who cares? This is still universally non-preferable, and that's the point. Okay? It's still universally non-preferable. Like, I don't care about the definition of the NAP here. I care about the principle. And the principle here is that things can happen that you won't like, that are universally non-preferable, that libertarianism and the NAP and all that crap, it does not address. It does not address it. Okay, let's move on. What else he says? But if you say property rights only extend to your own person and you alone, then you get the tragedy of the commons. No one owns anything, so they use anything they can to depletion. If you say people can come together as a group and do things collectively, then what's stopping other people from just taking everything if no one owns it? But no, they didn't contribute, so they can't. Okay, so the tragedy of the commons, if you don't know, is pretty much this, it's a model that says if people just act selfishly all the time without sort of stopping, then eventually they'll deplete some integral resources in the long run, and that'll just screw them over, right? It'll screw over the entire species in the long run. That is true. And he's saying, what he's basically saying here, what this guy says, is that property rights is the only way to stop the tragedy of the commons from happening. You know, you need property rights, because if you don't get property rights, then what's stopping people from doing stuff like that? You know, from just being selfish and depleting integral resources? Yeah, I see, okay, I'm coming to the realization is that I think the problem with you libertarians is that you see property rights as the only way of solving the problem. Well, okay, some of you might see property rights as the only thing that matters, but some of you might think, okay, well the problem here isn't that there weren't property rights, okay? The problem with the tragedy of the commons is that people behave selfishly. Now ask yourself, can we fix that? Can we get people to not be sociopaths? Can we get people to not be selfish? Given that there's selflessness in the world, I think the answer to that is obviously yes. If it can exist, then what's stopping it from existing on a global scale? See, this is the difference between us. I think that the real evil here is selfishness, and that to fix everything, to create sort of human paradise, which is the virtue, the entire endeavor of morality is to fix the species, then what you're fighting is evil. What you're fighting is selfishness itself. You're not fighting a lack of property rights, right? So you think property rights is the only way to stop selfishness from happening, but it's not. In fact, not only does it not stop selfishness, it actually allows selfishness to thrive, because it also protects selfishness. Okay? Because if you can't aggress against selfishness, then because of property rights, then the selfish are allowed to stay on their property and continue to be selfish and continue to be a drain on resources and whatnot. And being a sociopath and being selfish is something you can manipulate the free market and manipulate people out of their property rights, and selfishness can still thrive in the free market. That's the big issue here. It can still thrive. You haven't fixed the problem. You've put a band-aid on a bullet wound is what you've done. You know, the bullet wound is that there is evil in the human soul, and you haven't fixed that. You've just come up with a little fence that you think fixes everything, but it doesn't. It doesn't fix the problem by a long shot. Okay, certainly some of selfishness is genetic, because sociopathy or psychopathy or whatever can be genetic, and there's no fixing that except eugenics, so let's not talk about that. A lot of selfishness, though, is cultural, and I believe that it can be fixed through, I don't know, cultural means, by talking, by teaching, by breeding a new sort of culture, right? Isn't that what Molyneux's trying to do anyway with his whole, like, therapy thing, is to teach empathy and to teach people to not bully their children and whatnot, right? He's trying to create a new culture. This is the exact same thing. You try to build a new culture by teaching people not to be selfish. What you don't do is try to put up an artificial fence that's supposed to fix things when it doesn't fix anything. When it's all the same, when it's at the end of the day, it's just a fence, right? So that's what I wanted to say about that. That's what I think about property rights. I don't believe in property rights. I don't believe in rights, actually. I think all rights are conditional. You know, to think that you have rights that are unconditional is so fundamentally naive. The only thing you have a right to unconditionally is empathy, as far as I'm concerned. That's the one thing you have a right to unconditionally. Empathy and love from other human beings, which isn't even something you get most of the time, but yeah, that's the only thing you have a right to. Not this. This is not something you have a right to unconditionally. And I can bring up examples where we break rights. Hell, Molyneux himself says we invoke self-defense when the nap gets broken. So obviously that's a consequentialist way of thinking right there, right? If your property is aggressed against, then you have the right to aggress back against your property, or back against the people aggressing against your property, right? So the very fact that that can happen means that the nap itself is conditional, right? By definition, it is, because the nap is violated when it gets violated by somebody else in the first place. Property rights are also conditional, and if they're conditional in his model, then they're conditional in general, is what I'm saying. The problem is he's saying they're conditional only in these situations and everything else is unacceptable. But it's not, because again, I can come up with an example where you would definitely murder if the consequence of murder was good. Let's move on. Okay, so this person said, I like Stefan Molyneux, but he is sometimes so naive and philosophically oversimplistic, and yeah, I know he hates this term. Wilhelm Friedrich, yeah, I couldn't agree with you more, man. Like, that's pretty much the case with Steph. I like him too. I don't hate the guy. I don't hate the guy. Forgive me if that's how it's come across. I disagree with, I don't even disagree with him most of the time. Hell, there was a video he came out with yesterday, or even today, about something, you know, it was one of his like therapy sessions where he was telling some, he was counseling some guy who was aggressed against by his mother. She beat him when he was a child, and I liked the video, and Steph made a whole lot of sense in that video. 100% agree with that. But then the libertarianism stuff comes out of the closet, and it's like, nope, this stuff doesn't follow. This stuff doesn't work, okay? When Steph talks about empathy and he talks about all that stuff works. That stuff I can dig. This stuff doesn't work because it's deontological and it doesn't flow. All rights are conditional. See, if you're, you know, if you're a murderer, you don't get property rights. Nope, you get put in jail. You don't, the nap is applied to you because you're a murderer. You know, if you're someone who threatens the species, you don't get rights, you don't get property rights, you get put in jail, you get put in a terrorist prison, or something to that effect. The only problem is, I feel like property rights and other rights are conditional in many more cases than that. Like, if you're some very incredibly rich sociopath on Wall Street, then no, you don't get any rights. You don't get property rights. I'm sorry. You don't get rights because you've already taken your fair share. You've already taken too much. Okay? You've already earned through the free market more than you should have earned. Okay? If you're leading a monopoly, if you're a monopoly at all, you do not get rights because you're a monopoly, because you are not allocating resources efficiently. Okay, and so on and so forth. Okay, there's these seemingly harmless things from the point of view of the nap and the point of view of the free market, but from a consequentialist point of view, they're not harmless at all, and so no, they don't get stuff like property rights and so on and so forth. They don't get that stuff because that stuff, they don't get these rights that sort of other people get because they shouldn't. It's bad for people. It's bad for everyone in the long run for these selfish individuals to have rights. That's the big problem with the nap, is it doesn't stop indirect aggression, okay? The free market can have a lot of indirect aggression through things like monopolies, through things like price discrimination, and so on and so forth, and that's just based on my very limited knowledge of economics. That's the stuff I can think of that a free market has that's incredibly problematic, right? You get other problems and stuff. Indirect aggression is a huge example. Like the example I just gave with the people in the property and they put up a sign that has like a middle finger to somebody on somebody else's property. That's indirect aggression right there, okay? It's aggression, but it's not aggression against your person or your property. It's just an aggression against your mind, your soul, right? But that's okay, right? Of course. Moving on. Oh yeah, and he says that Molyneux hates the term oversimplistic. You know, I'm not surprised that he does, because he probably hears that term all the freaking time, because I'm definitely not the only one who says that he's oversimplistic. You're definitely not the one that says he's oversimplistic. He probably hears that shit, and he's tired of it, because if this is people telling him that he's not good at something. But he is oversimplistic. He's incredibly oversimplistic. Okay, if I can come up with problems in his philosophy so easily, then he has to be oversimplistic. Okay, this next gentleman, he said, what did he say? So when is the initiation of force? Okay, yeah, he didn't like my video. He was actually speaking out against it. So when is the initiation of force outside of defense acceptable? Also, you ignore the ability to ignore a take on bad consequences and still hold on to principles no matter how arbitrary. Sorry, you ignore the ability to ignore or take on bad consequences and still hold on to principles no matter how arbitrary. Your thinking is motivated by a mindset that some people are better than others and have the right to use force to impose their will upon those deemed inferior. Okay, so let's look at the first half. So when is the initiation of force outside of defense acceptable? Also, you ignore the ability to take to ignore or take on bad consequences to hold on principles. Why should you have to take on bad consequences? Why should you have to ignore or take on them? That's the weird thing here, is that sometimes Molyneux says you should take on bad consequences. You should. Okay? You either can ignore them or take on them. Why? Why is it so important to take on bad consequences? Why can't we just avoid them altogether? Avoid them from happening. Why do you have to punish people this way? That's what he's doing. He's punishing people. Okay, if you've made bad choices, then you have to take on the bad consequences because you're responsible, because you need to be punished and to learn, to gain humility. That's what you need to do. I have no words for that. That is, oh, that's so stupid. That's, okay, that entire line of thinking stems from this whole, like, colloquial, modern misinterpretation of free will and determinism and that shit, and the belief that people are responsible for their actions, and the belief that you should be punished for doing something bad simply because you did something bad, not because, you know, not because the consequences are bad, not because we need to fix you or because we need to go on with our lives and help the species somehow. No, because you did something bad and you deserve to suffer for it. That's what's going on here. That type of thinking is archaic and horrible and wrong. And I simply am against it. No, I don't think you should... The ability to ignore or take on. I believe in the ability to avoid bad consequences as well, sir, and I think that we should simply avoid them if we have the chance. I don't think you should sentence people to bad consequences just because you believe they deserve it. I think if a bad consequence can be avoided, then it should be. That said, that doesn't mean that people who have done bad things are suddenly allowed to get away from it scot-free. No, obviously not. We don't put people, as Sam Harris says, we don't put people in jail because we think that they're assholes and deserve to die. No, we put them in jail because we can't allow them to be in free society because they would harm other people. Okay, we do it because of the consequences. We don't do it because we arbitrarily think that these people should suffer. That's the point that I'm being made. That's the point I'm making here, and that's the point that should be made. Okay, consequentialism. Your thinking is motivated by a mindset. Okay, no, it's not. Like, I don't even know what you're saying here. And have the right to use force to impose it. Okay, well, first of all, you believe this as well, if I believe it, because you believe that the NAP doesn't apply if you're being aggressed against. Ergo, you have the right to impose your will against someone who's aggressing against you. Ergo, they're inferior to you because they didn't apply the NAP, and therefore you can aggress against them. That's the argument here. All I'm saying is that, I mean, in general, all I'm saying is that people who are motivated badly, people who do bad things, people who can cause problems, should get their rights revoked. Okay, they don't necessarily deserve to have property rights and non-aggression principle rights and rights of any kind if there's a chance, well, not if there's a chance, but if they're bad people, if they're not motivated in the right way, if they're not doing the right thing, if they're selfish, so to speak. Sociopaths, if they're sociopaths. Sociopaths don't get rights, in my opinion. Okay, they don't get rights. Okay, if someone can be clinically diagnosed as a sociopath, then they basically belong in jail, without question. You know, they don't get property rights or any sort of rights. The very idea of allowing them to exist in the world is toxic and horrible. They're incredibly dangerous, okay? You know, maybe most people don't think of sociopaths sort of in a romanticized way because you haven't actually encountered them or having dealt with them. I have. I've dealt with a sociopath. They're not pretty people, okay? You don't want to have sociopaths around. You don't want them. You just don't. They don't belong in society. They simply should not be there, okay? And they're 100% selfish too. They can't be fixed. They can't be made selfless, okay? If that's what you're worried about. They can't be fixed in any way. They can't be helped. Literally the only thing you can do is to isolate them and prevent them from harming other people. So let's move on. Right, so no, I don't think that I'm superior and that people that are inferior deserve to be aggressed. I mean, depends what you mean by superior and inferior, of course. This is all semantics at the end of the day. But in general, no. What I think is that whether you should have property or not, or whether the very idea of... I don't even like the idea of property in general, but in general... sorry. Your rights are conditional all the time, is what I'm saying. Okay? They depend very much on who you are as a person. They depend very much on what you've done. They depend very much on what you're willing to do and what you desire to do in the future. They are not unconditional, as Molyneux postulates. And this next gentleman asked me, you could talk to him about this stuff on his call show. Yeah, I could. And believe me, I've thought about it, and I'm still thinking about it, but there's issues. Okay, for one, if I were to call in his show, what I would do is I would actually do the therapy thing that he does and take advantage of that and see what he thinks about my situation in life, because honestly, I'd be more curious about that than what he thinks about this. Because I'm pretty certain that he's wrong about all this. And I'm not really interested in hearing his side. The one thing I am interested in hearing is how all of this fits together in his head. Because I generally want to know how it comes together, because it really, really doesn't make sense. Of course, I wouldn't go to this show and talk to him about that on principle, because on principle, I would be, I'll be honest, I would be afraid. I would be afraid to talk to him about this stuff, because... if you ask me, he isn't always fair, not on his show, not on his call show. The other issue is that there's a time limit, and if you're not communicating with him properly, then what's stopping him of just, cutting you off and moving on to the next caller? And he's done that. I watched a video where he just didn't like how the caller was presenting himself, and he cut off the caller like 30 minutes in. He still gave him a chance, but he eventually just cut the guy off, and I thought it was premature. The video is called How to Become a Scumbag. I think it was pretty recent, like the last 2 months at least. So yeah, you could go watch that video and see for yourself. I don't think he's always fair. Honestly, I think the way that Molyneux deals with critics isn't fair. The way if you're communicating with him in a way that he likes, the way that he enjoys, then he's a saint. But if you say something he doesn't like, then he treats you like a heckler, pretty much. That's what he treats, that's how he treats critics. He treats him like hecklers. That's the biggest issue for me, is that he would treat me as a heckler, I imagine. Maybe probably because of my personal disposition and the way that I go about this stuff. So yeah, that's my fear of talking to him. I'm not saying I'm counting it out, but yeah, that would be the issue. I don't believe he would be fair. I would love to talk to him about it, but I wouldn't want to do it on a show, which sounds pretty arrogant. But just think about it objectively. His show is a different type of environment. It's sort of a therapy show, if you ask me. That's kind of what it is. There's a time limit, there's other callers, you can't just sit there and debate this whole thing. What I'm interested in is sitting there and debating this whole thing and actually getting down to the bottom of the issue. And honestly, I don't think I could convince him of anything. He's believed this stuff for like decades at this point, so I don't have a chance of convincing him. And that wouldn't even be my motivation. I'm not even motivated. I mean, I am, but there's no way I could do that. The only thing I would want to do is to figure out how he actually thinks. In sort of perfect detail. And I don't know if that's worth it, given how, given that his call-in show is sort of a therapy thing, and I don't know how he would react to my questions. I could be wrong about that, and I could be wrong. I'll let you decide if I am. I'm not, I'm just not 100% on that, as well, say. Alright, so the next person said, Lois Lane said, okay, so she basically came up with an example. She heard on a podcast where Molyneux said something something along the lines of, oh, okay, I didn't write her whole comment down because it was too long, I'm sorry. We choke this kitten or the world ends, and Steph does not believe in things universally, is what she said. Okay, so what she said was she came up with an example of a podcast where Steph said something that was not in line with consequentialist, not in line with deontological thinking. It was a consequentialist viewpoint that, you know, let's say we choke this kitten or the world ends, and he said we choke this kitten, of course, because we don't want the world to end. That's what he said. And this Lois Lane mentioned that when push comes to shove, he wouldn't adhere to his principles. He would actually do the consequentially valid thing to do. You know, he would do the thing that yields better consequences than follows principles. And by the way, that right there is one of the best arguments for consequentialism, in that it is unavoidable. It is literally inevitable. Everybody is a consequentialist, including Molyneux. And yeah, look, like if this is true, then great. Then he's a hypocrite. Then there's a contradiction, actually, because I know for a fact that I found online somewhere somebody quoting him in a podcast where he said that consequentialism is wrong because consequentialists ignore the fact that a principle gets broken. And I mentioned this in my UPB video. Okay. Well, see, it directly contradicts what Lois Lane here said. That directly contradicts what he said in another podcast, apparently, where he said, oh, we do the consequentialist thing because we don't want the world to end. Okay, great. So you are a consequentialist. Good. I'm glad we had that cleared up. Why you say you're not? Why Steph says that he's adheres to principles? I don't know. But there's clearly a contradiction here. There's another contradiction that I keep pointing out, though, is that the very fact that the nap is allowed to be broken in these circumstances is a consequentialist model, okay? If X, you do Y. If you're in situation X, you do Y. That is a consequentialist moral... That is a consequentialist morality right there. That is a consequentialist claim, okay? Steph cannot be a non-consequentialist by virtue of the fact that the nap can be broken in certain circumstances, by the fact that the nap can be violated if it was violated first by somebody else. You are allowed to invoke the self-defense principle if the nap was violated. That is consequentialism. No way, there's no way around that. That is 100% consequentialism. All I'm asking for is that we apply consequentialism in a much broader sense than just murder, rape, theft, and that's it. So yeah, thanks for bringing that up, Lois, because that's actually hilarious that he said that, because that goes against his principles completely. Imagine, okay, we choke this kitten or the world ends. Imagine that it's a human being for a second. Okay, suddenly it's harder to make the choice. You know, choke this human being or the world ends. What do you do then? You choke the human being. Like, I'm sorry, you choke the human being. There's no way around that. You can do it with love, okay? And don't laugh, but I'm being serious. You can do it with love. You have tears coming down your eyes. You can apologize. You can be like, look, I'm sorry. I have to choke you. There's no way around that. You can make the experience as peaceful for that individual as possible. But you have to choke them. There's no way around that. You just have to. You have to. Otherwise the world ends. And that's a much worse consequence. And this is why principles, deontological, ethical principles are silly. Okay, so the next commenter, I have just two more of these that I wanted to talk about. So the next person, this Furious Fat Man, has said, so he just had a bunch of statements. He said, the state is violence, government violates the nap, watch his vids on that instead of the hot topics, 3 minutes in and you've said nothing really, this isn't how critique works, state his view, counter with facts, move on to the next, that's it. Now better you, Now, before you do more vids on Steph, go watch his vids on the nap, and P.S. stop fucking with your hair. Alright. Okay, so let's go over this. So the state is violence, government's nap, that's just, you're just saying things that you believe in. Okay, I'm glad to know where you stand. Watch his vids on that instead of the hot topics. I have watched his vids on that, okay? Believe me, I have. Don't tell me that I haven't. Don't tell me that I should watch those vids more. The reason I even made the UPB video was because I watched those videos, right? And things didn't add up, okay? It's not like I came across Steph for the first time and I had to make a video. No, I knew his channel for months before I decided to make that video. I actually did my research. I watched a whole bunch of videos where he talked about his libertarian beliefs, and it doesn't add up. It just doesn't add up. It doesn't add up for all the reasons I mentioned, and that's why I made this thing. The other problem with it is I acknowledge that my interpretation of Steph's interpretation of the nap may not be accurate. I knew this. That's why in the video, in UPB, when I talked about the nap, I talked about the nap in several ways. I said maybe the nap means A, or maybe the nap means B, or maybe C. And I talked about the problems with all three interpretations. Okay, because I knew maybe my version of the nap, or the way I interpreted it, wasn't the version that Steph had in mind, wasn't the version that was actually there. So I knew preemptively that my interpretation wasn't going to be perfect. Here's the problem. I know for a fact that from watching more of Steph's vids, I'm not going to understand the topic any better. I'm not going to, like, I might understand Steph's thinking a bit more, but the problem, my criticism isn't going to go away, okay? Because maybe, you know, I like how you assume here, I like how you assume that I just didn't understand him, okay? The very fact that I use several definitions of the nap in my critique means that it's not my understanding that's the problem, it's that the nap as a whole is just a fundamentally flawed concept and shouldn't be anywhere. It's just a fundamentally flawed idea, okay? That's the point here. And I like how you assume that I'm just someone who didn't understand something. Maybe Steph misinterpreted something. No, but of course he couldn't, because he's I don't know, he's older than me, he's been doing this a lot longer. Okay, that's not a good reason. But surely you're entitled to your opinion. Actually, no, you're not entitled to that opinion. That's just silly. Like, yeah, I think you're wrong. I think you should reevaluate everything you believe about the nap and everything you believe about Steph, because I know for a fact, no matter how many videos of his I watch, no matter how long I talk to him, the nap will not become any less a flawed concept. It is fundamentally a flawed concept, okay? That's the point, and that's why there's a critique of it. That's why it shouldn't factor into one's morality, right? 3 minutes in and you've said nothing really. Okay, well, okay, if you have a problem with how I presented the video, that's an entirely different subject. You can mention that and we could talk about that, and that could be a whole other issue. The reason I didn't start making arguments 3 minutes in is because I was explaining what UPB was to people who didn't know what it was. I was explaining it. I was assuming that the audience didn't know where I was coming from. I don't think that's wrong. If there's a problem with my presentation style, and I'm sure there are, then by all means, that's like, let's debate that. Let's talk about that, about how I can improve that. But that's not an issue. The points in my critique are not invalidated because you didn't like the way I talked about them. Steph himself does not make perfect critiques, okay? Like, a lot of the time, he doesn't make arguments, he just goes off on little segues and tangents and talks about, he comes up with all these metaphors for what's happening to just sort of, and metaphors and analogies instead of just moving on to the next argument, right? That's annoying too, okay? I mean, it's cool and I like it from time to time, but then there's times where he like keeps coming up with more and more metaphors when in reality I'm just like, look, stop and just move on, okay? So let's not argue here that there's a perfect way to do a critique and that there's individuals that do it perfectly and that there's people that don't. Okay, everybody has a flaw with the way they present themselves. And I want to mention here, yeah, including Steph. Steph has a problem with how he presents himself as well, if you ask me. Nonetheless, like, unless the way I was conversing got in the way of what I was saying, then there's a problem. If not, like, if the way that you say something doesn't get in the way of what you're actually saying, if I could still understand you, then there's no problem, if you ask me. Then you don't have to change your style, okay? Unless it really, really bothers me to the point that, no, I can't handle it, then yes. But otherwise, no. And otherwise, no, you don't get to say, oh, this isn't how a critique is done. This is Molyneux arrogance right here. Okay? I can tell that you're a fan. Yeah, because I remember there's a video where Molyneux said the exact same thing. He said, this isn't how you do a critique. And he just, like, that's not an argument. That's not an argument. This is not how you do a critique is not an argument. It doesn't invalidate what the individual is saying. Okay? So just because you didn't like the way they presented themselves doesn't mean it was wrong or it was bad. I'm only just going to say, like, no, there's a correct way of presenting yourself and there's an incorrect way. No, there isn't. Every single person's way is simply different. The only time it can, the only circumstance in which the way one presents a critique is wrong is if it gets in the way of what they're saying. If you literally can't listen or pay attention or understand, okay, like if they're speaking in a different language, for instance, okay, then there's a problem with how they critique. And if that's the case, then you have to talk about it and try and figure out a way to communicate in a way that you understand one another. But don't act like there's this, like there's a Plato's form for critique and that I just didn't adhere to it. Right, and the final comment, stop fucking with your hair. Well, okay, if you notice, I don't just fuck with my hair. I've done that a lot this video, actually. Don't just fuck with my hair, I fuck with my hands. My hands are always doing something, okay? That's an idiosyncrasy, okay? I'm a fidgety kind of person. That's just who I am. I do that a lot. I do that all the time. Asking me to not do that, easier said than done. I'll just say that. I can't just stop that. Maybe I could work on that and fix that, but ultimately I don't think it's much of an issue. Unless, of course, it gets in the way of your enjoyment of the thing, in which case, okay, fine. But again, that's something that needs to be addressed and talked about before we go about actually changing it. I don't know if it bothers people that much or not. By all means, if it does, let me know. And I will try to keep the hair touching to a minimum and just keeping things down here, alright? Anyway, I only have one more of these left, but before doing that, I'm going to take a little break, so stay tuned, BRB. And I'm back. Right, and the last question, the very last question I just wanted to mention was, this person asked me, so he asked me, what would be your opinion of libertarianism not derived from deontological ethics? And he went on to say that he thinks that even for consequentialists, libertarianism makes sense. What does that mean? Okay, so deontological ethics, for those of you who are not familiar, is pretty much ethics that is based on principles. Ethics that is based on laws, you know, moral laws that need to be adhered to all the time, no matter what. That is called deontological ethics. There is no question of consequence and whatnot. That's what it is. Consequentialism is the opposite. It's when there is adherence to consequence, or maybe not the opposite, but it's another side of the spectrum. So what's my opinion of that? Pretty much, so it's clear from UPB then that I don't agree with deontological ethics. What do I think about libertarianism as a whole? And I thought this would be my opportunity to mention that. So he thinks that it would actually make sense as a consequentialist model to improve the world, so to speak. Okay, here's how I look at morality. I'm just going to mention this. Here's where we are. Here's where we want to get to. Morality is a question of how do we get there and stay there. So politics, economics, all that stuff, all normative questions for those disciplines is just, it's just morality applied. Political philosophy is just applied morality. It's applied ethics as far as I'm concerned. And as far as libertarianism is concerned, even as in a consequentialist model, I'm skeptical. Because it's a question, okay, what it is pretty much, so we want to get to point B, and we use a libertarian model to get there. I'm skeptical for a few reasons. Okay, well, I'm skeptical for the first reason I don't even actually know what is libertarianism. Is libertarianism where we want to get to, or is it the process? Because I don't see libertarianism as the place I want to get to. I don't actually even know what a libertarianism world looks like. I know that Molyneux thinks that he says that there's going to be like conflict resolution organizations or something of that sort, but there's no state. Is there a hierarchy of any sort? Because that's kind of a big question, right? That's kind of a big question for that. Yeah, at the end of the day, I don't see libertarianism as the place we want to get to, because libertarianism doesn't make... It's not enough information at the end of the day. It's not enough information, okay? I mean, think about, okay, what does paradise look like? What does our utopia look like? Is a big important question in morality, okay? Where do we want to get to? That's a huge question. Libertarianism doesn't even answer that question, let alone provide us with a means... or a good means. I don't think libertarianism even answers the question, because at at most, libertarianism says some stuff about how the economy works, but it doesn't say anything about how the culture works. Okay, it doesn't say anything about how people work, what people think of one another, because that's really the most important question. Okay, politics and economics are culture applied. Okay, no, let's go back a few steps. Everything in human behavior can come down to two things. Either it's evolutionary, either it's at the bottom of Maslow's hierarchy, right? It's stuff that you need simply because you're a Homo sapien, simply because of your genes. And then there's stuff that you need or want because of culture, because of intellect, because of, you know, all these things that develop up here, so on and so forth. That's at the higher end of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, I take it. Morality is a question, what do we do, how do we satisfy those needs for people? What needs do we satisfy? For whom do we satisfy those needs? And how do people satisfy such needs for one another? Okay, it's a very complicated topic. Now, me myself, I have an idea of what this point B, this utopia, looks like with my morality. I think my consequentialist morality does answer that. It at least answers how the culture looks like, what the culture, what people's interactions amongst one another appear to be. Libertarianism doesn't do this. In my opinion, libertarianism skips a step. Okay? It's morality, moral principles, then cultural principles, then economics, and then politics. And that's the final category here. You can't even begin to fathom, to question, to have opinions on what the economy and the politics will look like in our utopia before even understanding what the culture looks like. Because the latter, the former is a manifestation of the latter, okay? The reason that our politics are the way they are is because our culture is the way it is. It's because our culture accepts the politics of today. It's because our culture fundamentally believes in democracy and all that stuff, and then fundamentally believes in the government and in taxation and in all that stuff. Alright? That is why I don't believe in libertarianism, even from a even from a consequentialist point of view. I'm open to the idea, but I don't agree with it, because I don't think it does what it's supposed to as a moral model. Okay, it's an economic model, but it's an economic model that isn't associated with a cultural model, and the cultural model is key here. Okay, I'm going to make a statement here that in general, if we want to talk about how the economy should be, we should first agree on how the culture should be. And before that, we should agree on what we want as a species, as morality. What things? Okay, this is the order of logic. Okay, first we decide what on Maslow's hierarchy of needs we want to satisfy for people. Okay, then we go on a way to do that, on a practical level amongst people. That's the cultural side of things. That's the how do we get there part. Then we start to talk about what the economics looks like in this utopia that we're trying to get to. And that's what, and it's my opinion, at least that's what it seems to me, that libertarianism does just that, but it skips the first two steps. Okay, it just does that in its deontological form. In a consequentialist form, it doesn't even work because it doesn't do the first two steps. So, you know, you specifically, I forget your name, but if you have an idea for the first part, the first part of the logic, how do we look at Maslow? You know, how do we satisfy Maslow's hierarchy of needs for people? And then the second part, and what does culture look like? Then I'll entertain the notion of libertarianism as an economic model. That's if libertarianism is the model we want to get to. If libertarianism is a method of getting places, then I would actually sort of be okay with it in a weird way, because see, the only thing libertarianism posits at its core is that there's no state, and I'm actually not against that idea. I don't think that my utopia, you know, my B state of society that we want to get to, the paradise that we're trying to build, that paradise does not have a state. I don't think it does. The way I'm seeing it now, it doesn't have a state. So if by eliminating a state or by changing the culture in such a way that a state is no longer necessary gets us closer to that, and it probably does, then yeah, I would be a libertarian. However, I don't think it's that simple, because at the same time that statelessness gets us closer to that, libertarianism can also take us farther away from that, because accepting stuff like more economic freedom and this whole free market thing, it's just a fantasy. From what I know about economics now, which is not a lot, I will say it's not a lot, but I am learning more. From what I understand from it now is that it doesn't actually work, because it's not. It seems to me like a huge excuse for people to just be selfish. That's what libertarianism seems to me. It's an excuse for people to be selfish and to not have to bother with other things, because the state and the state's the taxation, despite calling it enforcement of aggression principle, whatever, the way I see it is, you know, the rich become rich because they manipulate the free market, and we have taxation so that they give some of that money back so that it's actually put to good use. It's not always put to good use because the state is not perfect, but I don't know, you know, that's always going to be a flaw, right? The principle itself doesn't seem to be a flaw. I think I'm very much in support of the idea that more control, so long as the people in control are good. As long as the people in control are good people. That's sort of what I believe in. And of course, we know that in practice they're not good people, and that type of thing will always attract people that are not good. But see, the thing is, I don't think the problem gets fixed if you just eliminate the system. No, you don't eliminate. I mean, if you eliminate the system, there's going to be a power vacuum that gets filled with something else. But if you eliminate the idea of hierarchy altogether, does that get fixed? I still don't think it gets fixed, because you still have indirect violence. You still have, you know, I mean, okay, no, that's getting into a whole nother topic, but if statelessness is stronger than statelessness, if it's hierarchy-less, if that's the libertarian paradise, if it's a state of being for society where there is no hierarchy, then I have to take a step back and see, okay, maybe, but I don't even know what that looks like, okay? I don't even know what a society without a hierarchy would even look like, let alone whether that's good or not. So you would have to tell me whether or not that even makes sense as an idea. But the way it is right now, if we don't eliminate hierarchy as an idea, as a notion, then eliminating the state would simply replace the hierarchy we have now with a new one. It's not going to fix anything. That's what I think about that. If we do, if we try to teach people to get along based on cultural empathy, that could work. But again, That's not libertarianism, which is why I sort of stress the point is that in your question, libertarian as a consequentialist, as like libertarianism is what we should do to get to paradise. I don't think that's how that works by definition, because by definition libertarianism doesn't actually do what it should be doing. It's missing the point. The point is there's a culture that is selfish and evil that needs to be fixed, that needs to be alleviated. Once you fix that, okay, or rather, the process of fixing that, the addressing that issue, that is not libertarianism. That is something else. That is something, I don't know what to even call that. There's probably a name for it, and that's the category that I fit in. That's my model for what negative consequentialist or whatever it is that you call it. That's what should be done to get to paradise. And that's what paradise has, is it has this perfect ideal culture. That's what we're trying to build. Libertarianism is honestly, it's like an offshoot model. Like it doesn't even make sense as an idea, because it misses, it ignores this entire, there's a gap. Like I feel like this whole question of what the culture looks like is a massive gap within the libertarian model. Because you can't start talking about the economics and the politics and the whatnot without at least agreeing on what the culture is like, right? And libertarianism says nothing about that. And no, I don't think, and right, the other side of it is just, well, what about just, how about we just eliminate the state right now, today? No, that's not going to work either. And Molyneux doesn't think it's going to work. He knows it's not going to work. If we eliminate the state like that, then somebody else comes and takes its place, okay? Because it's in our culture, right? So we have to fix the culture. Right, that's the issue. But fixing the culture isn't libertarianism; it's something else. That's how all this puts together in my framework. That's the fucking, sorry for cursing. That's the Molyneux problem in a nutshell, though. That's the Molyneux problem in a nutshell. That's the libertarian model problem in a nutshell. Okay, is that libertarianism? It skips over the problem, okay? The problem is this thing here. It's the culture. That this is the evil, the selfishness and the evil in our culture. That's the problem. Libertarianism does not address it. It does not address the problem. It addresses the state. The state is evil. Well, why? If you're trying to fix evil, if that's what the point of philosophy is, and I'm quoting as Molyneux says, then by all means, don't be skipping steps, okay? The problem is the culture. Figure out a way to fix the culture. Then start talking about what that means for economics. Because as it stands, libertarianism just is making very vague, very arbitrary claims about what the economics in an ideal society should look like, without even appealing, without even beginning to talk about what the culture looks like, without even beginning to talk about how people behave towards one another and what they do with one another and what they engage themselves in, what virtues they adhere to. And I know Molyneux adheres to virtues a lot. Here, okay, I've pretty much answered your question, but I'm gonna send my conclusion here is to pretty much say, like, to summarize for once and for all what the issues with Stefan Molyneux are. Now, I've already mentioned the issue with libertarianism. It's that it skips a step. Not that it's wrong as an idea, although I'm skeptical of that. It skips a step. Now, that's the case if libertarianism is the paradise we're trying to get to. If libertarianism is the paradise we're trying to get to, well, then I'm saying that cannot be, because it skips a step. It skips the process. Okay? It doesn't make a claim as to the process and the culture. If libertarianism is the process, then it's definitely false, because there's no way that type of process works. Okay, I'm trying to, like, if you guys understand that, please let me know, because the 15 of you or whatever that watch me as of this making, please let me know if you understand what I'm trying to say. Okay, morality. Here's morality. Here's point A. Here's point B. This is where we want to get to. This right here is the mapping that maps A to B. Libertarianism cannot be B, is what I'm saying. It cannot be state B, because if it's state B, it's inconsistent, because it skips a step, it skips the cultural step, it says nothing about culture, and culture is the fundamental backbone of society. It cannot be the mapping either, because if we start eliminating the state, all of a sudden then there's just going to be other problems. So it doesn't fit either category. The problem with Molyneux is that he doesn't realize this. That's one problem. And it's incongruous, like it's so dissonant that he doesn't understand this, because he's a virtuous individual. He believes in empathy. He believes that people should be good to one another. He believes in not being shallow. He believes that all the stuff at the top of Maslow's hierarchy of needs is the good stuff. He believes that stuff. I know he does, because I've seen it in his videos, because I've watched like dozens of his videos. I know that he believes that stuff. And yet, when it comes to morality, it's this weird, broken, offshooted thing. Like, that's what libertarianism is. He adheres to that, of all things? Like, it doesn't add up, I'm saying. It doesn't make sense. It's dissonant. Furthermore, and you know it's dissonant, because like there's contradictions in the thing he says. Like I mentioned in this video, okay? At one point, he's in one podcast he says that he's not a consequentialist, and the consequentialists are basically wrong. In another podcast, he says that, yeah, you choke a kitten to save the earth. That's a consequentialist argument. And libertarian, and his NAP model to begin with is a consequentialist model, because you're allowed to break the NAP if somebody else violated first, right? So he's a consequentialist. So there's that sort of dissonance, and you have that stuff all over the place. Like, if you keep watching his videos, you will find contradictions in what he says. I guarantee you will find contradictions. Okay, the people who have not noticed these contradictions, they either don't watch his whole videos, which would make sense. I mean, his videos are pretty long. I don't know, like, my videos are pretty long too. Hey, I mean, I'm like the only person on YouTube that actually watches like 3-hour videos and front to back. I've watched every Molyneux video I've watched, I finished. Okay, so yeah, that's just me. I'm weird. Okay, I'm sorry, but if you watch his entire videos, you will find contradictions. Okay, like it seems to me like the audience for Molyneux, they honestly, they do watch it for the hot topic. They do watch it for the fancy metaphors and the occasional artistic word use that he'll use, and the sensationalized element of it all. That's what it seems. It seems very sensationalized. Like, ooh, we're at this philosophy channel. We're going to talk about philosophy here and do philosophy and all that great stuff, right? But the reality of it is that's just not it. That's just not how that stuff works. Philosophy is largely bullshit, and your channel, by virtue of the fact that philosophy is largely bullshit, your channel will also be largely bullshit if it's about philosophy. And yeah, it is. And there's contradiction everywhere. And the final thing I'd have to say about that is that what I hate absolutely is the arrogance. And something I absolutely cannot stand about him. This arrogance he has, that everything that he's come up with is derived from first principles and just philosophical fact, and that philosophy is the same as other disciplines, which it's not. I take it like you actually have to study other disciplines to be able to say that. And philosophers, please by all means get mad at me for saying this, but philosophy is not like other disciplines. And no, you cannot. You can't have Steph's approach to philosophy. You can't have this approach where you're basically right about everything that you've derived. Because that's the approach that he has. He has the approach that he's right, that it's derived from first principles, and that anything else is just bad philosophy. And he's had this view for a long time. And what I mean by that isn't that he's had this view about philosophy for a long time. What I mean is that he's had this view that what he's derived about UPB and the NAP and all that stuff is good philosophy, and everything else is bad philosophy. He's had that view for a long time. And that's scary to me. Because that amount of cognitive dissonance for that long a period of time is just, how do you not go insane? How do you not go insane from all the variables that don't add up together properly, right? So there's that. I forget what I was gonna say. Yeah, honestly forgot what I was gonna say. Like, you could be cognitively dissonant. Right. The problem with Molyneux, at the end of the day, is that... Oh, I remember what I was going to say. Sorry. Right, this whole good philosophy, bad philosophy thing, it contradicts one of the most basic tenets of philosophy itself, which is something that Socrates himself put forward. Right? And which is ironic because Molyneux is apparently inspired by Socrates, according to his Wikipedia. So that's another thing that doesn't add up right there. Socrates said, and what he said, and what I'm sure anybody who's ever studied philosophy knows, is that you have to be very, very aware of how ignorant you are. You have to be very aware of how little you know. You have to be humble, is what you have to do. You have to be very, very, very humble. You have to have humility when approaching this discipline, and how you at no point can you think that you have everything figured out. I don't think I have everything figured out. By all means, I don't. But Molyneux definitely thinks he does. He thinks he has, I mean, he thinks it's good philosophy. That mindset itself is not a humble mindset. That is not a philosophical mindset. A philosophical mindset is pretty much the mindset that every waking minute, at every point of time, all the time, everywhere, anywhere, I could be wrong about everything. That's what a philosophical mindset is. I could be wrong about everything, all the time, everywhere. Everybody could be wrong about everything. That's what philosophy is. That's what the philosophical mindset is. That's why I say it's largely bullshit, because you have to assume that you're wrong all the time. And you have to assume that other people are wrong all the time, and they usually are. Okay? Everything is always in a sort of state of flux in philosophy. You can never be certain. Every idea, every notion is always being challenged. And I don't get that sense from Molyneux. That's what's weird. I don't get that sense. I get the sense that he's very, very certain. He's very, it's like he feels like he's found Plato's forms. He's found the true forms of reality, of morality. That's what UPB is. And that's what doesn't add up. That is the biggest problem. That is the anti-philosophical model in a nutshell. That I know how everything works. I figured it out from first principles, and that's good philosophy. That is not good philosophy. That is not philosophy at all. That is delusion and dogma and nonsense is what that is. And religion, by all means. Okay? That is not good philosophy. The dissonance, I would say. That is the Molyneux problem in a nutshell. And if you don't agree, then by all means, I don't know what you're even paying attention to. You must not watch his entire videos if you don't agree, because I guarantee you, you would find contradictions with things he said, where where one thing he says in one video contradicts what he says in another video, and where something in one video contradicts something else within that video itself. You find that all the time. I don't think anything I've said has ever contradicted anything else that I've said, right? So I don't know, I know for a fact I'm not in that category, okay? It's weird, I don't understand if the audience that watches Molyneux, if they actually believe in everything he's saying, because every time I look at the comments section of Molyneux's videos, there is debates all over the place. There's people who disagree, there's people who agree, there's arguments all over the place. So I take it that the people that comment are people that don't agree all the time. But there's tons of likes on the videos, although I guess if people disagree, they don't necessarily dislike a video, because disliking a video, that takes some kind of balls, I guess, to dislike a video on YouTube. I don't know. Like I would never dislike a video like, oh my god, like, what, do I hate this? Like, you have to hate something to dislike it on YouTube, pretty much. Which is weird, because if you have a dislike on a video, it's like, oh, whatever, some asshole disliked my video, but in reality, it's like, personally, I would say I would never dislike a video. Like, if I didn't like the video, I would just turn it off and not watch. To actively sit there, watch the thing, and then click dislike, like, I would have to be petty to do that, pretty much. Granted, I like the fact that the dislike system is there. Anyway, that was a tangent, and I'm be done with that, and I'm sorry for boring you with that. But hopefully you did enjoy the video, and thanks for sticking around if you did, all 10, 15 of you. Anyway, stay tuned, and I look forward to seeing you next time. Ta-ta.